Howdy, folks. I know it's been a while. I apologize for the delay in reading. The holiday season has got me jumping through all kinds of hoops, and it's been difficult to try and find time to record. I did want to try and get something out before the holidays. I'm hoping that once we get past them, I'll be able to get back onto a more regular reading schedule. But in any case, I'm glad that you guys are here. And without any further delay, let's get to chapter 16 of Specter of the Past. Well, General, Admiral Pellaeon said, leaning back in his seat as he accepted a small glass of curious brandy from the other. How are things at Yaga Minor? About the same as always, Admiral, High General Hestive said, waving at the distant planet centered in his office viewport as he poured a little of the brandy into his own glass and sat down again behind his datacard strewn desk. Very quiet. I understand there's been some recent unrest among segments of the Yaga population, Pellaeon said. Completely negligible, Hestive said, waving a hand in dismissal. Actually, since the overwhelming majority of the populace is completely loyal, they mostly take care of the handful of dissenters themselves. The only time we normally have to lift a finger is to protect the dissidents from overzealous loyalists, allowing you to take the moral high ground. Exactly, Hestive said. It makes for a refreshing change from our usual image among aliens. Yes, Pellaeon murmured, sipping his drink. A pity the Emperor didn't work harder at that kind of public relations himself 20 years ago. A pity someone who wasn't so insanely blind with power didn't overthrow him while there was still time, Hestive countered, an edge of bitterness in his voice. There must have been hundreds of competent administrators or fleet officers who could have kept the Empire alive. Pellaeon felt a catch in his throat. There was one, at least, he said quietly. Hestive's lip twitched. Yes, Grand Admiral Thrawn. I've always regretted the fact that I never had the chance to meet him. For a moment the two men sat in silence. Then Hestive cleared his throat. But I don't suppose it gains us anything to count the might have beens, he said. That was the past, this is the present, and I presume, Admiral, that you're here to discuss the future. Pellaeon took another sip of his drink. Yes, he said, watching the other closely. To put it bluntly, the war against the New Republic is over, and we've lost. In my professional military opinion, it's time to talk peace. The muscles around Hestive's eyes tightened. You mean surrender? I'll be negotiating for terms, Pellaeon said. If I do a proper job, I think we should be able to keep most of what we have. Hestive snorted. Such as it is. We still control over 1,000 inhabited systems, Pellaeon reminded him mildly. Would you prefer we allow the New Republic to whittle that number down further before we accept the inevitable? The New Republic's in no shape to do much whittling at the moment, Hestive said. It looks to me like they're poised to go for each other's throats, not ours. Certainly they have problems, Pellaeon said. But if you're expecting them to collapse into a full-fledged civil war over Kamas or anything else, I think you're being unrealistic. Begging the Admiral's pardon, but I respectfully disagree, Hestive said. Particularly if we engaged in a little judicious pushing of our own. Pellaeon stifled a sigh. Yet another argument he'd heard over and over again on this trip. So you'd have us encourage them in their self-destruction, he said, emptying your shipyards if necessary, draining all the manpower and resources from your ubiquitous base, leaving this system totally defenseless. If it's necessary to go that far, yes, Hestive said. This is a military base, Admiral. That's how its resources are supposed to be used. Granted, Pellaeon said with a nod. And what do you suppose will happen when they find out that we've been goading them? There's no reason they need to find out, Hestive argued. We don't have to use our Star Destroyers or TIE Fighters or anything else obviously Imperial. No, Pellaeon shook his head. We can keep up such a charade for a while, maybe even a long while, but in the end they'll find out, and then they'll unite again, at least long enough to destroy us. Hestive looked out the window at the blue-green sphere in the distance. At least that way we'd go down fighting, he said with obvious difficulty. Your way. There's no honor in surrender, Admiral. There's no honor in wasting lives for nothing either, Pellaeon countered. Hestive smiled wryly. I know, but at least if you're dead, you don't have to live with the shame of it. There are some in the fleet who would call that a noble warrior attitude, Pellaeon said. Personally, I'd call it stupid. If we're destroyed, if we all die, the concepts and ideals of the New Order die with us. But if we surrender, we can keep those ideals alive. Then, if and when the New Republic self-destructs, we'll be positioned to rise again. Maybe then the galaxy will finally be ready to accept us. Hestive grimaced. Perhaps. There's no disgrace in backing out of a no-win situation, General, Pellaeon said quietly. I saw Grand Admiral Thrawn do it more than once, forthrightly and without embarrassment, rather than waste his men and ships. There's no more or less what I'm proposing we do right now. Hestive swirled his drink restlessly in his glass. I presume you've already consulted with the Moffs about this. I had, Pellaeon said. In the end, they agreed. Reluctantly, I suppose. None of us is exactly enthusiastic about it, Pellaeon said. We simply recognize that it has to be done. Hestive took a deep breath, exhaled it. I suppose you're right. I wish you weren't. He lifted his glass, drained it in a single swallow. Very well, Admiral. You have my support, which I presume was the real reason you came to Yaga Minor. Is there anything else I can do for you? As a matter of fact, there is, Pellaeon said, pulling out a data card and handing it across the desk. First of all, I'd like you to run this list of names through the Ubiquitate Base's computer system. Certainly, Hestive said, sliding the data card into its slot and keying his terminal. Anything in particular you're looking for? Unaltered information, Pellaeon told him. These are people I suspect of having shady financial ties to Moff Disra, but we haven't been able to track the connections. And Disra wouldn't let you look through the Bastion records, Hestive suggested with a wry smile. I'm sure he would have, Pellaeon said. I just don't happen to think I'd be able to trust what those records said. Well, you can trust these, Hestive assured him, keying his board. No one gets into my records without proper and double-confirmed authorization. That major from the Obliterator, Tierce, certainly found that out when he tried to... Major Tierce, Pellaeon interrupted him. Major Groden Tierce? Yes, that's the one, Hestive said, frowning. He was here on behalf of Captain Trazyn, only we couldn't make contact with the Obliterator to confirm the authorization, so we wouldn't let him into the system. Why? Is something wrong? Yes, Pellaeon gritted. Major Tierce isn't attached to the Obliterator. He's Moff Disra's aide. Hestive's expression turned to stone. Is he now? Pellaeon gestured towards the terminal. Is there any way to tell which records he might have tapped into? I just told you that he didn't get in. Oh, he got in all right, Pellaeon said darkly. Through a terminal no one was watching, or perhaps he brought one of his own and tapped in at a junction point. But he most certainly didn't leave without whatever it was he came here to do. Hestive was keying his board. You're right, of course. I'll order a check, and while we're at it, let's have him run his ID again. The examination took just under an hour, and in the end they found what Pellaeon had begun to suspect they would find. Nothing. This doesn't make any sense, Hestive growled, glaring at his display. We know he was here, and presumably not just for his health, but there isn't a single sign of access or tampering. So what in blazes did he do? Did you check all the records? Pellaeon asked, swiveling the display around and running an eye down the listing. Of course we did, Hestive said, his tone a little huffy. Everything from the basic maintenance files on up to... No, Pellaeon said, staring at the display as a sudden chilling thought hit him. You didn't check everything. You couldn't have. Begging the Admiral's pardon, because there are records you don't have access to, Pellaeon cut him off, scrolling down the listing. Specifically, the special files section. Hestive's eyebrows lifted. You can't be serious, he said. Are you suggesting a lowly major could access the Emperor's own sealed records? I agree it sounds unbelievable, Pellaeon said, but we're running out of options. But a major? He's an aide to a very slippery Moff, Pellaeon reminded him. I wouldn't put it past Disra to have found a way into the special files. In fact, considering his ambition and lack of discernible ethics, I'd probably find it more surprising if he hadn't. I still don't believe it, Hestive said heavily. But as you say, we're running out of options. He cocked an eyebrow. I don't suppose you can get us into those records to check this out. Pellaeon shook his head. The codes and procedures were lost long before I rose to the position where I would have been instructed in their use. Pity, Hestive said. If we can't get in, we aren't going to be able to figure out what he was doing in there. That is the big question, isn't it? Pellaeon agreed, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. He couldn't have been looking up something. The records at Bastion are duplicates of the ones here, which implies his purpose was to add, delete, or alter. Hestive muttered something under his breath. Which implies those names you're investigating may have more of a history with the Empire than you thought. Perhaps, Pellaeon agreed soberly as another unpleasant thought struck him. But there's one other possibility. If I wanted details on the attack that destroyed Kamas, where would I look? Hestive shrugged slightly. There should be copies of all the media and official reports in the regular files, both current time and follow-up. And if Palpatine was personally involved, as the rumors suggested? Hestive exhaled noisily. Anything like that would be in the special files section, wouldn't it? You think that's what Tierce was really after? Or he was after that plus Disra's ally list, Pellaeon said. As long as he was in the files anyway, why not do both? Why not indeed, Hestive said, drumming his fingers thoughtfully on the desktop. The question is, what would Disra want with the Kamas files? Whatever it is, I doubt very much that it has anything other than Disra's personal aggrandizement at their core, Pellaeon said sourly. And for that reason alone, I want to know what it is. I think, General, that the two of us ought to begin a quiet search for someone who might be able to access those records for us. I'll begin making inquiries immediately, Hestive promised. Where can I contact you if I'm successful? I'll be out of contact for a while, Pellaeon said, standing up. I'll communicate with you when I get back. Thank you for your assistance. Any time, Admiral, Hestive said. And best of luck with everything. And it was finally time, Pellaeon knew, as he headed down the corridor from Hestive's office towards the docking bay where his shuttle was berthed. The Yaga minor shipyards were the last stop on his tour of the Empire's meager defensive facilities, and he had gleaned as much support from the senior military as he was going to get. It was time now for the lonely journey to Pellaeon. He grimaced. It had been 3 weeks now. 3 weeks since Major Vermal would have arrived at Morisham to try to contact General Bella Bliss. 3 weeks since he and his Corellian corvette had vanished without a single trace. The increasingly unavoidable conclusion was that he'd been intercepted somewhere along the way, either by random pirates, overeager New Republic forces, or dissident Imperials. He'd been a good officer, even a friend, and Pellaeon would mourn his loss and miss his service. But at the moment, the critical question was whether he'd be able to deliver his message before that interception occurred. There was no way for Pellaeon to know. He would simply have to show up at Pellaeon and see if Bella Bliss did likewise. And if the other did not, well, he would deal with that when and if it became necessary. And that's the end of the chapter. Talk to you all soon.